Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest Professor Art Carden. Hello, Art. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great, Art, and I really enjoy your pieces. Do you remember an article you wrote several years ago titled "The Greatest Thinker You Have Never Heard of"?
Yes, I do.
Yes, you're referring to Ludwig von Mises.
hmm
Why is Ludwig von Mises important?
Mises is important for a lot of reasons, obviously. I think the most important reason is, at least for me, is his socialist calculation argument. Now, granted, that's within the broader, that's a very narrow contribution within a much broader spectrum of really important contributions to how we think about the world. But I think that's the one that is um, most applicable, in my opinion. Of course, that follows from the rest of his work, but at least in terms of practical importance, I think his economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth article is probably his most important piece.
But interestingly, Art, I've been familiar with Ludwig von Mises for some years, but
Mhm.
it is evident that he's not really popular in America.
He is and he isn't. So Mises is an interesting character because he was a distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association, if I remember correctly. His magnum opus, Human Action, was published by Yale University Press. He was on a short list of economists who, um, according to Paul Samuelson, who was another great economist, would have won a Nobel Prize had the Nobel existed prior to when it was initiated. Um, he's a very important thinker and is nonetheless really influential, even though some people might not notice. So, for example, Friedrich Hayek's economic calculation article is, or his economic calculation argument has a lot of very important roots in Mises, and an enormous amount of neoclassical economics since World War II has built on some of the knowledge and information insights of Hayek, and by extension, Mises without necessarily knowing it.
Exactly. And the art. Another important point about Ludwig is that he wrote on individualism and economic freedom and the relationship between these variables and development.
Right.
So Ludwig was a pioneer in that regard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Of course, I mean, the first development economist in some sense was Adam Smith, writing an inquiry into the uh, nature and causes of the wealth of nations. But Mises, of course, really contributed to this as well with his work. One of his early books, Nation, State, and Economy. His 1920 article, again, on economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, which turned into a book that appeared a couple of years later, just called Socialism, an Economic and Sociological Analysis. And so much of the work that he did in that book, then later again in primarily Human Action, became or was concerned again with the nature of economic progress.
Yeah, Mises is such a broad thinker. He
Mhm.
even wrote on nationalism and colonialism.
Right, right. Yeah, Mises is remarkable in a sense, remarkable in many senses. When he's writing Human Action in English, he's writing. I think that was his fourth language. I think after German, French, and I believe Italian. Um, he wrote on virtually everything. He was very much a man of the Renaissance, very much a man who had kind of an integrated economics that appreciated the rest of the humanities and the social sciences, and also again wrote on a lot of things that we now. They're now sort of at the front of public policy debates. Like, for example, you mentioned indigenous issues and colonialism.
Yes, and Ludwig was never in favor of colonialism,
No.
and I often remind people, if you are a true liberal, you're against
Mhm.
colonialism because it is expensive.
Right. Yes, that's a really important point. Colonies are very expensive. I think it was Benjamin Disraeli in the middle of the 19th century in England referred to the colonies as a millstone around the neck of England. I mean, then he changed his view later and embraced colonialism. But while it is true that the sun never set on the British Empire, it was a system that extracted resources from common people for the aggrandizement of politicians and people like Cecil Rhodes. So yeah, colonies were very expensive. They did not contribute to economic growth.
Art, I'm interested in corruption, and corruption
Oh.
has gotten a bad rap in the literature, and in some cases, corruption actually deserves this rap. But I also believe that we should create a distinction between rampant corruption and procedural corruption.
Mhm.
Art, are there examples of corruption or corrupt activities inducing growth?
Yes. So in 2010, an economist named Lisa Verdon and I had a paper that was published in the Law and Development Review asking exactly this question. And it's part of a kind of a group of papers that appeared around the same time by different scholars asking about the extent to which corruption can actually increase growth. And it's true that corruption is in a lot of ways like a tax on economic activity. So if the health inspector, for example, shows up and demands a $500 bribe, or he's not going to write a good report, that's a tax on economic activity. But there are some societies where the red tape is just so thick that corruption actually increases growth by making it easier for people to do things. And that's actually one of the things that we found is, in particular, in places with relatively little economic freedom, corruption can actually be growth increasing.
And I agree with you, Art, and this is why I employed the term procedural corruption.
Mhm.
So, for example, when leaders are committed to economic freedom, research suggests
Mhm.
that even if they are corrupt, people are still likely to invest because the corruption is
Mhm.
procedural. Whereas I
Right.
consider rampant corruption to be loose corruption. It is not driven by any grand ideological motive. A few people are just interested in getting wealthy.
Mhm. Yeah. So in that case, I'm really not sure that someone needs I'm not sure that someone needs a commitment to economic freedom in order to have corruption that increases economic growth. I think it just, yeah, I think it's in the worst of circumstances, perhaps, that corruption increases growth. So in places like the former Soviet Union, for example, probably nothing would have gotten done were it not for corruption and black markets. In India during the license Raj, before liberalization, hardly anything would have been able to happen were it not for corruption. And I'm not sure that corruption, to be effective, corruption requires any kind of commitment to economic freedom on anyone's part, really. Because it seems like if there were a commitment to economic freedom, you just get rid of opportunities to be corrupt.
No, the study was recently published by the Journal of Institutional Economics,
Mhm.
and the writers were arguing that some corrupt countries do well because the entrepreneurs have confidence in the ability of leaders to remain committed to economic reforms. So even if the country is corrupt, people are still going to invest because the leaders are serious about long-term development.
Okay, yeah. So I'm actually not familiar with the paper that
Yeah, it's new. It's a new
you're
paper.
referencing.
It's
Okay,
really new.
yeah. I'll have to take a look at it.
Yes, but and I believe that your work is applicable for many countries in the developing world where bureaucracy is is an expense.
Right. Yes. Bureaucracy is very, very expensive, and one of there are a few different ways to think about it. You can think about needing to have a very efficient bureaucracy that kind of takes care of dotting I's and crossing T's and makes sure things happen. So, like Britain, for example, is famous for having a very efficient bureaucracy. But you can also have bureaucracy that's efficient and stifling. So, for example, the Chinese imperial bureaucracy for the better part of Chinese history has been relatively efficient, but it's been relatively efficient at thwarting economic growth.
Art, you're so correct. Just before signing on to do this interview, I was reading an article by two distinguished economists, and they cited the study of Ellman and others, arguing that the imperial system in China actually thwarted innovation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the imperial system in China definitely thwarted innovation in no small part because entrepreneurship was sort of looked down upon and sneered at by Chinese elites.
And what's also interesting about the imperial system in China again is that
Pardon
it
me.
is it is usually seen as meritocratic, but
Mhm.
what some scholars do not tell us is that for the most part the beneficiaries were from the elite.
Right. Yeah, in a sense, it's meritocratic because you have the Chinese imperial examinations, and you have to do very, very well on those in order to become an imperial Chinese bureaucrat. But the ability to do very well on examinations is going to be very highly correlated with socioeconomic status. That's true, for example, of college admissions exams in the United States. Um, I am not sure, frankly, how much corruption there was in the say buying and selling of positions within the Chinese imperial bureaucracy. But I do know, for example, that there was a lot of that kind of activity in the European guilds of the, say, roughly the 12th century through the 18th century, where the sons and daughters, well, not really daughters, honestly, but the sons of guild masters had sort of an inside track into guild membership. And many guilds actually sold master designations without requiring any sort of training.
All right. I don't know if you're familiar with David Delacroix's latest paper on the topic, but David has a new paper on the issue we're discussing now, the guild system and the decline of
Mm-hmm.
nepotism.
Mm-hmm.
It's fairly recent. And he
Let me look
argues,
here.
yeah, you can look him up.
Yeah.
I had him on the show recently, and he argued that decline of nepotism in the West is correlated with economic development.
Yeah. That would make perfect sense. One of the major problems with any sort of bureaucratic system is that it's probably going to encourage that at least somewhat. To the extent that countries are able to move away from nepotism and toward sort of more meritocratic system, resources are going to end up in their highest valued uses, and economic growth is going to end up taking place.
Exactly. Art,
Mm-hmm.
originally, well, sorry, later in the conversation, we're going to talk about the book you
Mm-hmm.
co-authored with Deidre McCloskey. But before
Yeah.
we do so, I have a question, Art. The
Mm-hmm.
Great Divergence, when did
Right.
it really start? Because I have access to new data, and every day new studies are popping up showing us that the Great Divergence actually started long before the Industrial Revolution.
I think that the consensus estimate now of when the Great Divergence really got going was around 1500 or so, but it really the roots of the major change in per capita income, the major divergence between the West and the rest, would have happened with the sort of rhetorical changes that were happening in the 18th century primarily. So a few decades around Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nations, give or take, is around the time that we really start to see this big change in per capita incomes in the West, while they're not really changing that much everywhere else.
And the Great Divergence is also multifaceted. So for example, there
Mm-hmm.
was a great divergence in business practices and
Right.
measurements.
Right. Yes. Yes. So one of the things that we discuss a little bit in our book, and that Deirdre McCloskey talks about in a lot of her work, is this sort of new zeal for measurement among Europeans or among European elites. It's sort of a use of Arabic numerals for business accounting and things of that nature. People started to value precision in a way that they hadn't previously.
Exactly. I would love to have Deidre as a guest on the show. I've read her
Yeah.
trilogy and many of her academic articles.
Mm-hmm.
So I trust that you'll help me to get her.
Yeah, by all means, send me an email. I'll see what I can do.
Yes, I would love to have Deidre on the show. Rhetoric is really important, Art. In my
Mm-hmm.
conversation with Peter Becky, he said that if you want to understand a culture, listen to the stories that they tell about themselves. So, for
Right.
example, I'm in a space where people may wear poverty as the badge of honor or may say that I'm suffering, and that's negative. You shouldn't be proud to be suffering. But if you really want to understand why some countries don't grow, listen to the rhetoric.
Right.
Uh,
Yes.
autonomy versus defeatism. Some cultures are more autonomous than others. In the West, people attribute success to individual traits, not to external agents.
Yes, that's one of the things that makes the West unique is sort of a culture of individualism and a culture that emphasizes our ability to do not anything we want to do necessarily, but an ability to take our circumstances and improve them through deliberate, concentrated, and specific action. That's something that has not happened everywhere, and it's certainly not happened for the better part of history. In most places, for most times, of course, like you mentioned, anything that happened to you was seemingly arbitrary. It was the will of the gods. It was something you had no control over. If good things happened to you, it was because the gods willed it. If bad things happened to you, it's because the gods willed it. And while it's true that there remains an enormous amount of randomness in the world, and while God's providence still remains a mystery, there's a lot in the world that is not as random or as arbitrary as we would like to think. In short, you can probably improve your position by working harder and saving more.
I'm happy that you referenced saving, because Deirdre McCloskey, in one of her books, she said that medieval peasants, they saved even though they were poor, but savings did not lead to the Industrial Revolution during the medieval ages.
Right. Yes, saving is great and you should do more of it, but people for almost all of history have saved and have saved a lot. And saving has not necessarily led to industrialization because there weren't really any great outlets for the saving. You didn't have any entrepreneurial outlets for the saving that would generate the kinds of returns that we've seen in the last couple of centuries. So mere saving alone is going to be insufficient to drive long-run economic growth. One of the examples we use in our book actually comes from Matt Ridley, the science writer. And he, in his 2010 book, The Rational Optimist, talks about the Acheulean hand axe, which is about hand-sized. And he said it's remarkably similar, at least in shape and things like that, to the computer mouse. Let me see if I can pop this thing out of here. There we go. Similar size, similar shape. And one of the things that we point out, though, is that merely piling up hand axes or merely piling up computer mice is going to be insufficient for long-run economic growth because you have very, very sharply diminishing marginal returns. The stuff of long-run economic growth is the idea accumulation that takes us from the hand axe to the computer mouse and now to other types of technology that we're just now beginning to understand.
Exactly. I'm also fond of Matt Ridley, but he has some quite unusual views on China, I would say. Matt thinks that China's immense potential to innovate. I don't disagree with that view, but China is governed by the rule by law. It's not a rule of law state. Right. And it's still not as collective, it's still not as individualistic as the West. So of course not. I'm not predicting a future for China that is more innovative than America or even the UK.
I can see that going either way. On one hand, you're exactly right that China is a country where you have a rule by law rather than a rule of law. But at the same time, China has traditionally been a very inventive civilization. Inventive, of course, is not necessarily the same thing as innovative. And with the liberalizations that have happened over the last 45 years or so, freeing that many people and that many minds could I'm not ready to bet on it, but could produce a flood of innovation. Of course, we could also see the Chinese Communist Party clamping down like they've been doing in the last year or two and putting the kibosh on that real quick.
Yeah, and Nina Wang, she wrote in her book that economic reforms made China rich. China became wealthy because of free market reforms, and Xi Jinping is a smart guy, so I'm expecting him to continue to invest in these reforms. But as you said, the administration of Xi Jinping has been clamping down on technology.
Right. Yeah. So the great firewall of China has gotten hotter and larger, and that's definitely something that concerns me.
Yeah, it concerns me too because especially in the developing world, people follow the trend of China
Mhm.
closely.
Right.
So if China goes rogue, other countries may follow.
Mhm. Right. And China's in a position very much like the former Soviet Union in the 20th century, where they can effectively compel forced saving in a sense, and then use that forced saving to buy political allies around the world.
Yes, especially in Africa.
Mhm.
Luckily for the Chinese, Africans do not resent the rise of China in Africa.
Right.
Many politicians actually view the rise of China quite favorably. They think
Yeah.
that Westerners are the problem. The Chinese can claim superiority because they did not enslave Africans.
Mm.
Well, there's one book written by someone called Don Watts. Let me look up his name. It's
Okay.
titled the Blacks of Pre-Modern China, but I want to
Mhm.
get his name correctly. Don
Okay.
Wyatt.
Okay.
Yes, his name is Don Wyatt. So he has a book, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, and he
Okay.
indicates that blacks were enslaved in China, which was on
Mhm.
a very small scale.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't go off on a tangent and say that the
Right.
Chinese enslaved blacks. So because of their history, the Chinese are viewed more favorably in Africa, and they
Mhm.
didn't own colonies in Africa either.
Right. Yeah. So the things that are really interesting about the Chinese is that the explorations that happened in China were the end of something rather than the beginning, because they cut off commerce with the outside world. They turned the guns inward and didn't really colonize the rest of the world, but rather ran an imperial administrative state over the territory that they controlled. In the case of Africa, it's true that the slave trade between, say, China and Africa was not nearly as extensive as it was between Africa and the West, but also there was a thriving trans-Saharan slave trade to the Middle East and a thriving Indian Ocean slave trade as well.
Yes, I am familiar with the trans-Saharan slave trade, but
Mhm.
most people aren't know more about the role of Europeans in
Right.
slavery and not
Absolutely.
necessarily about the role of the Arabs or Asians. And as
Absolutely.
such, Europeans have little political capital.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point. And my guess is that in the United States and various other Western countries, a lot of people would be surprised to learn that slavery existed somewhere other than, say, North and South America, or that there was a slave trade anywhere other than the Atlantic Ocean. But that's perhaps a different matter.
Yeah, and indigenous societies also had slaves, and there is evidence to suggest that pre-contact slavery existed in Africa, meaning slavery
Mm.
before contact with the Arabs and Europeans.
Yes. Mhm. Yeah, slavery is an ancient institution that has existed in pretty much every society for all of time.
Just like white people, the Romans had slaves, and what was the
Mhm.
complexion of these slaves?
Well, the very word slave in most languages comes from the word Slav, so which basically means Eastern Europeans, Caucasians in short.
Yes, so but where so you're an American art, but
Mhm.
where are you from? Your ancestors, are they all from America? Are they from England? Where are you from?
The British Isles. So
Okay.
you go back probably, I don't know how many generations, but you get to Scotland and England.
Oh. So were your ancestors enslaved at any point?
Almost certainly. I don't know when that would have been, of course, because virtually everybody probably had ancestors who were enslaved at some point. I can only say that statistically it's likely. I'm not aware of any specific examples. I am unfortunately aware of specific examples of some of my ancestors owning slaves in the 19th century.
Oh, okay then. Well,
Yeah.
and that's the problem now, Art, because
Mhm.
your ancestors more than likely were slaves, but they also own slaves, and
Mhm.
you're white, so you're basically the devil now.
Well, I mean, it's yeah, yeah, I'm not so sure about that, but we do have, definitely, at least in my family, we have much better records of being the oppressors than we have of being the oppressed.
Okay, then. All right. Art, you seem to
Mhm.
be interested in Walmart. Why?
Yep.
Why is Walmart so fascinating to you?
So Walmart is fascinating for a few reasons. First, it's sort of the cutting edge of late 20th and early 21st century capitalism. If we look at the retail sector over the decades since the early 1960s, productivity growth has been incredible. And so much of the changes in standards of living in countries like the United States has come about as a result of improvements in our ability to get manufactured goods into the hands of consumers. So an enormous amount of the value added has come a little bit later in the supply chain. With respect to Walmart, it's an enormous firm with an enormous operation that employs millions of people, and that gets a bad rap from a lot of people in the United States and a lot of people around the world. In let's see here. So I finished graduate school in 2006, and in 2006, 2007, a couple of friends and I started looking into the relationship between Walmart and various aspects of what we might think of as a good society. So, social capital, for example, or individual values, or how people use their leisure time. And so we did some empirical analysis and found that, okay, this claim that Walmart is somehow destroying the world or making us worse off is lacking. It's not exactly supported by the data. And I think while of course there have been a few negatives. So one paper that we published looks at a small increase in obesity that we can attribute to Walmart supercenters. On net, Walmart has been a positive. And we think of Walmart as kind of a stand-in for bourgeois capitalism.
Do you know what's interesting about Walmart, Art?
What?
It confirmed what researchers do know, but what other people tend to view as something that's not obvious. High growth firms are usually in
Mhm.
the retail sector, not necessarily IT.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that makes Walmart so fascinating is that obviously they were very innovative and they adopted a lot of information technology, but a lot of the efficiencies they were able to squeeze out of the supply chain came from reorganizing technology that we had for decades, not necessarily from inventing new stuff. So I forget the precise effect of barcodes on Walmart productivity, but it wasn't as revolutionary as we might think. Walmart's Retail Link satellite is an amazing system, but once again, it's not it's not as revolutionary as, say, what they were able to do with respect to how they organize their warehouses and where they put their warehouses and distribution centers. They were able to achieve what the economist Thomas Holmes called economies of density by tightly packing their stores near distribution centers and being able to get stuff from the distribution center to the store very, very quickly.
So, in other words, Walmart growth is driven by organizational efficiencies.
Right, right.
And I'm happy that you're mentioning these relevant claims because I've often contend that though innovations are important, process improvements are
Mhm.
equally significant.
Right.
And when a country is at a complex level of development, it may need more process improvements
Mhm.
than radical innovations. What's
Right.
your take?
I really don't know. I do know that process innovations are very important, and process innovations are where a lot of economic growth comes from. Um, I'm sort of enough of a radical subjectivist to say I don't know that there's one that is necessarily better than the other, but I do know that it's very important not to discount process innovations relative to just inventing new gizmos and gadgets. Coming up with better and more efficient ways to write email, say, or just to organize your day can be every bit as productivity increasing as new software. So just to use an example, I kind of inhabit that space just a little bit, sort of the world of personal productivity and figuring out how to get things done more quickly. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of systems out there, and some of them are a lot of them are technology independent. Merely adopting an existing system can be every bit as productivity improving as adopting a different software program or something like that. So again, just to go another step further in thinking in terms of examples. So David Allen's book, Getting Things Done, which came out in 2003, or the original version, I think was 2003, is the best book on how to organize your workflow that I've ever seen. And you can do it with any technology. You can do it with paper, you can do it with computers, you can do it with all sorts of different things. That for me meant a huge boost in productivity, just as buying a software program called OmniFocus, which is actually based on the GTD methods, which I bought this about a year ago. That also increased my productivity. But coming up with the process innovation that was GTD was at least as important as coming up with new software tools.
Exactly. So in the IT world, process mining is presently a big deal. And instead of lamenting that innovations are declining, maybe people in the world of entrepreneurship should be directing their energies to creating better processes.
Yeah, that's probably right. That's probably right. I am. This is something I've spent a good bit of time thinking about. I'm a big fan of new software. I think it's always cool. But learning how to use that software is that's definitely somewhere where, at least in terms of how I manage my time, things kind of miss a foothold. And then also the bigger, broader principles about, thinking about exactly what is to be done, when, where, why, and how can be much more productive than merely saying, okay, I've got a bunch of new software tools I'm going to throw at my life and see what seems to actually matter, see what actually seems to make a difference.
And remember, software is complicated, and complexities can create distractions.
Yes, yes, yes. Complexity can create distractions. It's very easy to kind of get lost in a rabbit hole trying to automate. For some reason, I keep coming back to paper clips, but to come and automate a system for managing your paperclip inventory. It's like, okay, that can be very, very efficient in some sense, but it just doesn't matter because paper clips are really not that important as a chunk of your overall, work that you have to do in a given day.
Moreover, another missing puzzle in the innovation debate is the role of micro innovation. So macro innovations create spin-offs, and these spin-offs are the micro innovations. And I'm wondering if the problem is that we have not been exploiting the spin-off effects of macro innovations. People are looking for the next big product when we can find many micro innovations.
Yeah, well, micro innovations just aren't as interesting, in a sense. They're not as newsworthy necessarily. They're the sorts of things that seem obvious once you think about them, or once you see that someone has innovated in a particular way, say applying a particular set of technology tools to something like academic writing. That's just not quite as thrilling as inventing a new type of internal combustion engine or something like that.
But micro innovations produce ripple effects, and I'm more interested in the ripple effects of macro innovations.
Right. Oh yeah. Yep.
You see, the problem with big innovations is that they're complicated. They're really hard, and people are driven by finance. Finance is one motivator for some to create new products. And obviously, it is evident that the brightest minds care about social media platforms because this is one avenue for them to make serious money. So maybe the better innovations are in science, but these innovations are long and arduous. So if you're a smart person, it's more sensible to invest in creating the new social media app than to revolutionize energy.
Oh, agreed. And the thing is, and this is again something else that Deirdre and I talk about in our book. Sometimes people lump together science and technology when the two are in fact distinct. And there's a lot of economic progress that happened during the 18th century, 19th century, et cetera, that didn't really rely on new advancements in basic science. I would love to see energy be completely revolutionized. I'm really not sure what the right amount of energy or the right amount of money, say, to be spending on that is. But I know that oh gosh, who is the it's a military contractor, I think, that runs the Skunk Works research lab. In 2013 or 2014, they claimed that they had a major breakthrough in cold fusion. They claimed to be making that breakthrough going forward. So while it is true that kind of big macro innovations like changes in how energy works are important, there are also some costs that come with that. So let's assume, for sake of the argument, that the lab leak theory of where COVID came from is correct. Then in that case, we have to balance this idea that, well, we need government to produce public goods like basic research, with governments are also capable of producing public bads with that basic research.
Okay, but well, you mentioned the lab leak theory of COVID. And I'm just going to say that based on what I've been reading, the argument is not necessarily that COVID was invented in a lab, but it leaked from a lab. I think that this is the argument. Scientists did not create COVID to destroy the world, but because the lab was below par, the disease leaked.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they were fiddling, as I understand it, and again, like I said, I don't know enough about the specifics or the science or anything that I haven't actually read anything about it in the last few months. I'm saying, let's assume, for sake of argument, that is true, and that it's at least the result of some fiddling around with viruses.
Yeah, but Art, what is also fascinating about the history of innovation is that for a long time, innovators collaborated with people who were not in their direct professions. But today, innovation is more bureaucratic. So if you're a scientist, you're expected to write on science. If you're an economist, you're expected to study economics. You shouldn't divulge into genes. And this is actually in their innovation, because innovation is really the cross-fertilization of ideas.
I think part of that is simply just due to division of knowledge. As the scientific enterprise grows larger, it's grown more specialized. In, say, the middle of the 1700s, I think you could read, like, one person could probably read literally every scientific article that was produced. Now, it's virtually impossible to keep up with everything that's produced in just a small handful of journals. So while I think that there's a lot to be gained from the kind of cross-fertilization you're talking about, I'm not sure that specialization and division of knowledge is really that much of a problem. Now, again, we mentioned Deirdre McCloskey, my co-author on this book that we have, and who's done a lot of other really interesting stuff. It becomes a problem if we specialize and then never talk to each other. If we specialize and then don't trade. That is a problem. She's argued in several essays that what we need to be doing with the results of our specialization is now talking across disciplines. And sadly and unfortunately, we don't do that as frequently as we should.
Exactly. Philosophers, well, business consultants can learn a great deal from philosophers. Philosophy is really about the good life. And in the business world, we talk a lot about gratitude and emotional well-being. But is the average management consultant interested in philosophy? I don't think so. Some of them are, but on average, I wouldn't say yes.
Yeah, well, they might be instrumentally interested in philosophy. They might be interested in what they can learn from philosophers that would be directly relevant to their task at hand. And I think that would be an example, though, of specialization and intellectual exchange, where we don't have to have the same passions about the same things in order to be able to cooperate.
So, Art, I asked you a question about Walmart, and this led to innovations and management practices. But now we're going to get back to Walmart. But this is a follow-up question. What is social capital, and why is it important?
Yeah, so social capital has several definitions. Social capital has been defined as the network of relationships that we use to get things done. It has been sometimes referred to as the social grease that makes transactions easier. It's sometimes referred to as a social glue that holds societies together. If we think about it in terms of networks and relationships, it's very important as a factor of production, because just like information technology makes it easier to communicate, and just like physical capital makes it easier to transform matter from one shape into another, social capital makes it easier for us to connect with people who might have different skill sets, different preferences, different knowledge, etc. A low social capital environment is likely to be one where there's not going to be a whole lot of innovation. Now, that said, there's a dark side to social capital as well. I mentioned European guilds. So Sheila Ogilvy's 2019 book on the European guilds, which I just reviewed for the American Institute for Economic Research, is very, very good in this respect. And it provides a lot of examples of how strong social capital can manifest itself in an advanced rent-seeking society.
Sheila, she's a really interesting scholar, quite first rate.
Yes.
Yeah, I love her work on the European marriage pattern, although I don't really agree with her assumption, but she's a pioneer, just like Deidre.
Yeah. Yes.
But
I don't have the book on my shelf here.
Yeah, but social capital is also important because of innovation. Countries that are low in social capital are usually poor and corrupt. And they're not innovative. Social capital, social capital lowers transaction costs.
Yes, I'm very, very glad to hear you say that. I spend a lot of time in my principles of macroeconomics class talking about transaction costs. And that's effectively, when I talk about social capital being kind of a grease that makes it possible for us to do things, that's fundamentally what social capital is doing, is reducing transaction costs.
Yeah, but when people trust each other, we don't need onerous regulations.
Right.
And regulations can actually create a new hindrance to social capital formation. And I'm sure you're familiar with that famous study that was done some years ago saying that new regulations actually created more problems for trust and social capital. Maybe it was done by some top-rate economists. I can't remember their names at the moment, but by the end of the show, I'll be able to give you their names.
Okay, yeah, I'm blanking on the paper that you're referring to.
Yeah, I think it's the Shalifa Andreas, maybe he was one of those people.
Okay.
Yeah, but is Walmart aiding the creation of social capital?
Not necessarily. What we found in the paper that we wrote was that there's not really a clear relationship between Walmart entry, Walmart expansion, and social capital. So one of the arguments that a lot of people had made about Walmart and why Walmart was bad was that it eroded the quality of community life. We said, well, okay, if that's the case, then presumably this should show up in some of these indicators that Robert Putnam pulled together for his 2000 book, Bowling Alone. And so we gathered his data, we put it together with Emmett Basker's data on Walmart locations, and we found that there really doesn't seem to be a relationship between Walmart and social capital.
But Walmart is not reducing social capital.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And this is an important finding.
Right. It is. Yeah, it's an example, I think, of a negative finding that matters, because you can think of social capital first as an input. Second, you can think of social capital as an output. So social capital can be an input insofar as it makes it possible to get things done. Social capital can be an output insofar as the relationships we have with our families and friends and the people around us are a very, very important part of a life well lived. So so looking at the relationship between Walmart and social capital and finding that Walmart doesn't really matter a whole lot suggests that we're not, that on one hand, we are not making ourselves less productive on net by embracing retail innovation. And second, we're not gaining the world and losing our souls, so to speak, by embracing retail innovation. It's not that Walmart is not making it so that we're spending all of our time playing video games alone rather than interacting with one another in social spaces.
The paper is titled Regulation and Distrust.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's with Jan Algan and Philippe Aguillon. Yes,
Okay.
that's the paper that I'm referring to. Well, Art, remember, Walmart is a huge business. And one of the advantages of Walmart is that it can force people to interact with each other.
How does it force people to interact with each other?
Repeat what you just said?
How does it force people to
Not
interact
force,
with each
sorry,
other?
not force
Okay.
people to interact with each other, but in the sense that it's this huge business with large suppliers and large customers, so it facilitates interactions.
Okay.
In that,
Gotcha.
not force. Yeah, force is the wrong word.
Yeah, I'm just being pedantic.
Yeah, and then Walmart also offers a wide variety of products that are most suitable for people in the lower income brackets. So
Right.
from a cost benefit analysis, Walmart is actually a plus.
Yes. Yeah. So you don't have the negative social capital effects that we mentioned having looked at. You have definite and unambiguous increases in per capita incomes, or at least reductions in prices, definite increases in material standards of living as a result of Walmart's existence. So I think if you do a cost benefit analysis, I think Walmart comes out looking very, very good.
And back to the story of mom and pop shops. Remember, mom and pop shops are in small communities.
Right.
If Walmart outcompetes these mom and pop shops and they die, what will happen? People will go to the Walmart. So again, human interactions are increased because of Walmart.
Maybe. I know that. So people who like farmers markets, for example, are fond of quoting statistics saying that people who go to farmers markets have more interactions with other people than, say, like people who go on trips to the grocery store. Which that might just be a selection effect. It might also be the fact that a farmers market is a very different experience from a trip to Walmart. I think that the total amount of human interaction is probably not really changing that much, and probably doesn't depend that much on exactly how we grocery shop. But I know that Don Boudreaux, another economist you should have on your show, years ago wrote a really interesting prediction that someday when Walmart goes out of business, the same sort of group of people who are lamenting the rise of Walmart will also lament the fall of Walmart and say that, oh, you need Walmart. You can get anything at Walmart. You'd see your neighbors at Walmart. Now we're all just sort of sitting at home ordering stuff from Amazon.com or whatever the next thing will be.
Yes, maybe you should do a study on the impact of Walmart on trust and diversity. Back to the mom and pop stores.
Yeah.
If you live in a predominantly white community, you're exposed to white people. With the growth of Walmart, you're exposed to non-whites. So maybe you should study Walmart from this perspective.
That's a very interesting hypothesis. I'm not sure. I don't have a good prior on what the data would say, but okay, yeah, that's a really interesting question, because so I know from a few years ago, we took a couple of trips to see a lot of national parks, and the way that my brother-in-law described patronage at national parks is very monochromatic. Meanwhile, we live in Birmingham, Alabama, which is about a 2.5 hour drive from Atlanta. If you go to the Six Flags in Atlanta, that's a melting pot of diversity. My guess would be that you have more diversity at a Walmart than you would have at a farmer's market, but I would be happy to be proven wrong.
Yeah, on this show, I like to give scholars homework.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yes, like Walmart is just such an interesting case study. Look at Sam Walton. Sam Walton was not really rich until he was an older man.
Right. He was doing pretty well in the 1950s, living in Northwest Arkansas. But gosh, I forget exactly when he first became a billionaire. But he was, gosh, how old was he? He was well into his 40s and into his 50s when Walmart really started taking off.
Yeah, Sam Walton was called the hustler back in the day because of his passion for business.
Right.
I've always wondered, what's the difference between a Sam Walton and a typical tech entrepreneur today?
I really don't know. I think that Sam Walton had a very different obsession insofar as he got into the retailing industry. He learned everything he could learn about retailing while he was stationed in the military in Salt Lake City, and learned a lot from the Mormon Church's retail operations there. I think Sam Walton's probably a lot more humble than
Yes.
the average Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur, and part of that I think is just due to his roots in Middle America.
And Sam Walton wasn't really impressed by fame.
No, he was not. No, he was not. He didn't really care that much about money. He did not want to be famous. He just wanted to run his store.
Yeah, exactly. Sam Walton was in the business of creating value, nothing else.
Right. Yes. Yes, he was in the business of trying to find a great deal for his customers. And in fact, that's actually a lesson that he sort of took from another retail innovator named Saul Price. Saul Price had started a company or a store called FedMart in San Diego in 1954, and then in the 1970s started Price Club, which was basically the first discount warehouse club. And Price actually said that in his role as a retailer, he saw himself as a fiduciary agent for his customers. And I think Walton saw himself in very much the same role.
Yeah. And the Walton children, they too have actually ignored the spotlight. And I admire people who work to create value. You shouldn't be interested in fame. And if you acquire fortune, it must be as a result of value creation.
Yes. Yeah. And that is something that Sam Walton did in spades.
Yes. No, and again, back to Walmart. Walmart and food security. Do Walmart supercenters improve food security?
Yeah, they do. They do. So a 2019 paper in Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy, we look at standard measures of food insecurity, and we find that when Walmart supercenters enter, these measures improve a little bit. So, and I think if I remember the data correctly, I don't have the paper in front of me. That was especially true toward the bottom of the income distribution. So, food insecurity was a major research issue, or is a major issue for a lot of people in the United States. And gosh, let's see, it was been 2013 or so when we initially started working on this, actually for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and because they were funding some research on this area. And again, we found that Walmart supercenters were associated with lower levels of food insecurity, meaning again that people had more access to what we would think of as enough food.
Oh, food. Hello. Yes, and do you remember the channels through which Walmart improved food security?
Let's see. So it's primarily just through increasing availability of food. That's the major thing that that's one of the major reasons why Walmart supercenters led to reductions in food insecurity. And then there's also pressure on prices. So firms, if they're going to compete with Walmart, are going to have to offer lower prices, better selection, things of that nature. There's a 2011 paper looking at the relationship between Walmart entry and what are called stockouts. So when stores run out of stuff, and stores are a lot less likely to run out of stuff when they face competition from
Walmart. Your paper is interesting, but the question is a bit counterintuitive. Because of economies of scale and institutional efficiencies, obviously Walmart will improve food security. Thinking otherwise is just having a negative opinion of Walmart.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You could tell a story in which Walmart comes in, drives all the other stores out of business, and in fact actually reduces people's access to particularly fresh fruits and vegetables, but just to food more generally because they wipe everybody else out.
But if those people are wiped out by Walmart, can't Walmart then fill the gap?
They can, but in this version of the story, which again, I don't think is likely, um, they then develop at least some monopoly power over food. So maybe they don't produce as much output.
Okay, I get your point, but again, I'm playing devil's advocate. What about the values of Walmart? Walmart was not founded on these values.
Which value specifically?
No, Walmart was founded on trust and creating value for its customers. So it's not going to monopolize food to shortchange people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Another version of the story. So another story one could tell kind of against what we're saying is something that kind of appears in some of the criticism of Walmart, arguing that Walmart is in a lot of ways subsidized by Medicare, food stamps, and programs like that. Basically saying, well, Walmart pays so little that its employees can't afford to buy as much food, and when they come in and wipe everybody out and they lower wages, that then might reduce food insecurity, or that then might reduce food security. These are things that are theoretically possible, I think empirically unlikely, and as we've seen in our paper, these are claims that aren't really supported by the data. And you're right, when you think about the things that make Walmart, or that make any good operation run, sticking it to people after you wipe out all of your competition would not necessarily be coincident with Walmart values.
Exactly. Now, since we're wrapping up, we can talk more deeply about the book you co-authored with Deidre.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
So you mentioned Deirdre's Bourgeois Trilogy. So Professor McCloskey has written 3 enormous books: the Bourgeois Virtues, Bourgeois Dignity, and Bourgeois Equality in 2006, 2010, 2016. What we do is we condense and expand a little bit of the work that she's done. And so in about 200 pages, we tell the story of how the world got rich, specifically as a result of the rhetorical change that Deirdre identifies in some of her earlier work. So you have a change in esteem, so a change in economic liberty and social dignity for innovators and entrepreneurs, and that ultimately led to what we call the Great Enrichment.
Bourgeois dignity. That's our term.
Yep.
Deidre, art. I have art. If I continue to read widely and work hard, will I become as brilliant as Deidre?
Oh my gosh. I would like to say yes, but I'm really not sure. I'm honestly not sure that's possible. But that's something I've sort of grappled with as I move into middle age. Like I'm struggling to be the best Art Carden I can be without having to worry about whether I'm as good as Deirdre McCloskey or any of a number of other people I look up to that I could.
Because Deidre, she writes about theology, science. She knows a lot of stuff.
She does.
And her understanding of theology is not superficial.
No, it is not. And that is that's a very, very important point. She's done her homework. So one reviewer of Bourgeois Virtues said that the key message was kind of sneering in the sense that the key message seems to be that Deirdre's read the library, won't let you forget it. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's sort of true, but she understands at a very deep level what she's read and how it relates to her main areas of expertise. It's a standard that's very, very, very hard to meet, and one that I hope, one that I would like to think I can hope more of us can meet at some point going forward. But she's truly one of a kind.
It's just like innovation, as Deidre said. Innovation was actually a theological word.
Yes.
And it was negative.
Right. Yes. People were anxious about innovations in their interpretations of Scripture, and there's at least one part of the book where toward the end of it, I thought that she might have actually introduced an innovation in scriptural interpretation that I was able to change just a little bit. But yeah, she's incredible, and someone who is theologically sophisticated, humanistically sophisticated, economically sophisticated, historically sophisticated, like Deirdre McCloskey, is just a rare gem.
And she's also adept at quantification. She's a brilliant mathematician.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Like, why is one person so talented?
That's a theological discussion. I'm really not sure that we're gonna have time for.
Yeah.
But here's the cool thing about a commercial society. The fact that everybody else's blessings are our blessings too, because of division of labor, division of knowledge, and things of that nature. And by virtue of the fact that someone like Deirdre McCloskey is writing books rather than leading armies and ruling countries, means that we all get to benefit from what she knows.
Yes, it was a pleasure to speak to you, Art, and I intend to get your book. So I'm going to follow up on what you said to me in the email.
Okay.
All right then. Bye.
Perfect. Bye.
All right then. Bye. Yeah.